Racist police officer wrongfully arrests black captain. What happens next is shocking. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. Officer Johnson and his rookie partner, David, were patrolling the city's streets in their police car. The air inside the vehicle was thick with tension as Johnson ranted about the recent changes in the police department's leadership. Can you believe they put one of them in charge? Johnson spat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This department is going to hell, in a handbasket. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had only been on the force for a few months, but Johnson's blatant racism made him uneasy. Maybe we should give the new captain a chance, he cautiously suggested. Johnson laughed derisively. You're too naive, kid. They're all the same. Can't trust any of them. As they turned on a main street, Johnson's eyes narrowed at the sight of a sleek black sedan that caught his attention. The driver, a well-dressed black man, was obeying all traffic laws, but something about him bothered Johnson. Look at that, Johnson muttered. But he stole that car. David frowned. We don't know that, sir. He's not doing anything wrong. That's what you think, Johnson retorted, flipping on the patrol car's lights. Time for a routine check. The black sedan pulled over smoothly. David could see the driver's shoulders tense as Johnson got out of the patrol car. Sir, please, David pleaded. This doesn't feel right. Johnson ignored him, approaching the sedan with a smug grin on his face. Reluctantly, David followed, his stomach churning with unease. As they approached, the driver's window rolled down. The man inside was composed but cautious, his eyes darting quickly between the two officers. Is there a problem, officers? He asked calmly. Johnson leaned in, his face inches from the driver's. License and registration, he demanded with a sneer. The driver complied, handing over his documents without protest, though David noticed the man's hands trembled slightly. George Harris, Johnson read aloud, his lip curling. What brings you to this neighborhood, Mr. Harris? I'm on my way to a meeting, George replied calmly. Is there a reason you stopped me? Johnson's eyes narrowed. We ask the questions here. Step out of the vehicle. George hesitated, glancing at David, who looked away, ashamed. Slowly, George opened the car door and stepped out. David could feel the tension rising. He knew this was wrong, but didn't know how to stop it. As Johnson began his invasive interrogation, David's mind raced, trying to find a way to defuse the situation before it spiraled out of control. What they didn't know was that this routine traffic stop would change their lives forever. Johnson circled George's car, like a predator stalking its prey, his eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle for any excuse to escalate the situation. Nice car you got here, Mr. Harris, Johnson sneered. How does someone like you afford something like this? George took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. Hard work, officer. I'm on my way to an important meeting. Can you tell me why I was stopped? Johnson ignored the question, his hand resting on his gun. Mind if we take a look inside? Actually, I do mind, George responded firmly. I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't consent to a search. Johnson's face twisted with anger. Oh, you've got something to hide, don't you? Without warning, Johnson abruptly opened the car door and began searching the vehicle. George stepped forward to protest, but David quickly stepped between them. Sir, please stay back, David said, his voice trembling. As Johnson searched, he discreetly pulled a small bag of white powder from his pocket with practiced ease and slid it under the driver's seat. David caught the movement out of the corner of his eye, his heart racing as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just racial profiling, it was a setup. Well, Johnson announced triumphantly, emerging from the car with the bag. What do we have here? George's eyes widened in disbelief. That's not mine. You just planted that there. Johnson smiled with contempt. Looks like we've got a drug dealer here. You're under arrest. As Johnson reached for the handcuffs, George's calm facade finally cracked. This is absurd. I'm telling you, that's not mine. David felt sick. He knew what he was witnessing was wrong, a blatant abuse of power. His father's words echoed in his mind. A true officer protects and serves all people, son, not just those who look like us. The tension in the air was palpable. George, realizing the gravity of the situation, looked at David with pleading eyes. Officer, you saw what happened. Tell him this isn't right." Johnson whirled around, glaring at David. "Don't listen to him, rookie. This is how we clean up the streets." David stood frozen, torn between his duty to his partner and his moral obligation to uphold justice. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, forcing him to make a decision that would change the course of his career and possibly his life. As Johnson moved to handcuff George, the situation teetered on the brink of explosion. The next moments would determine whether justice would prevail or if an innocent man's life would be destroyed by prejudice and corruption. The world seemed to slow down as David watched Johnson reach for the handcuffs. At that moment, a flood of memories overwhelmed him. The proud smile on his father's face when he graduated from the police academy, the countless stories of integrity and honor he had heard growing up, the oath he had taken to protect and serve. "Stop!" David's voice rang out, surprising even himself with its firmness. Johnson froze, his hand halfway to George's wrist. "What did you say, rookie?" David stepped forward, positioning himself between his partner and George, his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve growing stronger with every passing second. "I said stop, Officer Johnson. This isn't right, and you know it." Johnson's face contorted with rage. "Listen here, kid. I've been on this force longer than you've been alive. You don't have the right to tell me what's right or wrong." "Maybe not," David replied, standing his ground. "But I know what I saw. You planted that evidence. This man is innocent." George, still tense, but now with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Johnson's voice dropped to a menacing growl. "You're making a big mistake, kid. I can end your career right here, right now. Is that what you want?" For a moment, doubt crept into David's mind. His dream had always been to be a police officer, to make a difference. Was he really willing to give it all up? But then he looked at George, saw the fear and desperation in his eyes, and knew he couldn't back down. "If standing up for what's right means losing my job, then so be it. I won't be a part of this." Johnson's face turned red with fury. "You're finished, you hear me? Finished. I'll make sure you never wear a badge again." David stood firm, his voice steady. "Go ahead, but I'm not moving, and you're not arresting this man on false charges." The tension between the two officers was palpable. George, sensing an opportunity, tried to defuse the situation. "Officers, please, there's no need for this to escalate. We can resolve this peacefully." Johnson turned to George. "Shut up. You don't have the right to speak." But David had found his courage. He placed a hand on Johnson's shoulder, pulling him back. "That's enough. He has rights, and you're violating them." The senior officer swatted David's hand away. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, kid. Don't think I won't report this insubordination." David stood tall, his father's words echoing in his ears. "Go ahead. I'd rather lose my job than lose my integrity." As the confrontation reached its boiling point, neither of them realized that this moment would be the catalyst for a change that would go far beyond this simple traffic stop. David's stand against injustice was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of their police department and their community. The air was thick with tension as Johnson, David, and George remained locked in their standoff. Traffic slowed as passing cars watched the scene unfold on the side of the road. George, realizing there was no other way out of the situation, decided to take a risk. "Officers," he said calmly but authoritatively, "I think there's something you both need to know." Johnson sneered. "Save it for the judge, buddy." But George persisted. "I am Captain George Harris, the new head of your precinct." The words hung in the air for a moment before their impact was felt. Johnson's face drained of color, while David's eyes widened in shock. That's impossible," Johnson stammered, his bravado evaporating. George slowly reached into his jacket, causing both officers to tense, but he only pulled out his badge and ID. "I was on my way to headquarters to meet with the commissioner when you pulled me over." David took the badge, examining it closely before handing it to Johnson. The senior officer's hands trembled as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. I didn't know," Johnson muttered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. George's eyes hardened. "Would it have made a difference if you had? Should it make a difference?" Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their position or the color of their skin. Johnson, desperate to salvage the situation, began to backpedal. Captain, I can explain. You see, we've had reports of drug trafficking in this area, and— Save it, George interrupted. I saw you plant those drugs in my car. Officer, he turned to David. I didn't catch your name. David, sir. David Anderson. And yes, I saw it too. Johnson's desperation turned to anger. He whirled on David. You traitor! After everything I've taught you, you're going to side with him? I'm siding with the truth, David replied firmly. George stepped between them. That's enough, Officer Johnson. Your actions today have not only violated department policy, but also the law. You're suspended effective immediately. Hand over your badge and your gun. Johnson's face twisted with rage. You can't do this to me. I've given 20 years to this force. And in those 20 years, how many innocent lives have you ruined? George asked quietly. How many people have suffered because of your prejudice? The weight of those questions seemed to crush Johnson, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his actions finally hit him. As George radioed for backup, a small crowd had gathered, many with phones in hand, recording the scene. The story of a corrupt cop caught in the act by the very man he was trying to frame was about to go viral. David, still processing everything that had happened, approached George. Sir, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. George placed a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing when it mattered most, Officer Anderson. That's what counts. As they waited for the reinforcements to arrive, both men knew this was only the beginning. The revelation of Captain Harris's identity had set the stage for a much larger confrontation, one that would force their department and their city to confront the deeply rooted issues of racism and corruption head-on. As the confrontation between George, Johnson, and David unfolded, the small crowd of onlookers grew, their phones capturing every moment of the tense scene. The quiet suburban street had become an impromptu stage for a drama that would soon captivate the entire city. Hey, isn't that the new police captain? Someone in the crowd murmured loudly. The rumor spread quickly, and soon people began shouting words of encouragement to George and David while hurling insults at Johnson. Justice for Captain Harris. Arrest the corrupt cop. We're with you, Captain. The chorus of voices grew, the energy of the crowd palpable. Johnson, his face a mask of anger and fear, looked around desperately, realizing he was outnumbered and exposed. In the midst of the commotion, a child's voice cut through the noise. Dad! George's head snapped toward his car. In the back seat, previously unnoticed in the chaos, was his 10-year-old son, Michael. The boy's eyes were wide with fear and confusion as he watched the scene unfold. George's heart sank. He had momentarily forgotten that his son was with him, on his way to be dropped off at a friend's house before his important meeting. Now, Michael was witnessing firsthand the ugly reality of the world George had tried to shield him from. It's okay, Michael, George called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Everything's going to be fine. Just stay in the car, okay? Michael nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Johnson, who was now backing away from the growing crowd. David, noticing the child, moved to position himself between the car and Johnson, his protective instincts kicking in. As the situation escalated, local news vans began to arrive, drawn by the social media buzz that was already spreading like wildfire. Reporters pushed through the crowd, shouting questions. Captain Harris, can you comment on what's happening here? Officer, are you being wrongfully arrested? Is this a case of racial profiling gone wrong? George raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd and the press. Please everyone step back. This is an ongoing police matter. We will answer all questions in due time. But the crowd was not willing to be silenced. Years of pent-up frustration with police misconduct were boiling to the surface. People began sharing their own stories of mistreatment and prejudice, each account fueling the anger of those around them. Overwhelmed by the turn of events, Johnson made a desperate move. He lunged towards the planted bag of drugs, intending to destroy the evidence of his misconduct. He's going for the drugs, someone in the crowd shouted. George, alert to the danger, acted with the speed and precision honed by years of training, tackling Johnson to the ground and pinning him firmly. Officer Johnson, you're under arrest, George announced, his voice resonating through the now silent crowd. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The crowd erupted into cheers as Sergeant Collins arrived to assist with the arrest. David, relieved, stepped forward to help as well. As Johnson was handcuffed and led to a patrol car, he began to shout, "This is a setup. You can't do this to me. I have rights." Maintaining his composure, George addressed the gathered officers and civilians. "Please remain calm. This situation is now under control. We will conduct a full investigation of today's events, and I assure you, justice will be served." The newly arrived officers, still piecing together what had happened, began to disperse the crowd. News cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of the dramatic scene. David, the adrenaline finally subsiding, approached George. "Sir, I want you to know that I'm willing to give a full statement about what I witnessed today." George nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "Thank you, Officer Anderson. Your integrity today is exactly what this department needs." As the chaos began to subside, George remembered his son. He hurried back to his car and opened the back door. "Are you okay, Michael?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" George hugged his son tightly. "Now we're going to make things right. This is why my job is so important, son." As father and son embraced, Sergeant Collins approached. "Captain, the press is asking for a statement, and the commissioner is on his way." George took a deep breath. He knew the real battle was just beginning. Johnson's arrest was only the first step in addressing the systemic issues plaguing their department. Looking at David, then at his son, and finally at the crowd of citizens watching expectantly, George straightened his shoulders. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope for real change. The reinforcements had arrived, not just in the form of additional officers, but in the awakening of a community ready to fight for justice. The real work was about to begin. As the scene stabilized, the air remained tense as the commissioner's car pulled up, lights flashing. Commissioner Mitchell, a stern-faced man in his 60s, stepped out of the vehicle, his expression a mix of concern and irritation. "Captain Harris," he called, approaching George quickly. "What the hell is going on here?" George straightened, meeting the commissioner's gaze. "Sir, we've had an incident with Officer Johnson. He conducted an illegal stop and attempted to plant evidence." Commissioner Mitchell's eyebrows shot up. "These are serious accusations, Captain. Do you have proof?" "Ido." David stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I witnessed the entire incident, sir. Officer Johnson planted drugs in Captain Harris's vehicle." The commissioner's eyes moved between George, David, and the patrol car where Johnson sat, his face a mask of anger and fear. "This is a nightmare," Mitchell muttered, then louder. "All right, I want statements from everyone involved, and someone get those news cameras out of here." But it was too late. The story was already spreading like wildfire on social media. Smartphones had captured every moment as Johnson was led from the patrol car to face the commissioner. "This is all a misunderstanding," Johnson shouted, his composure finally breaking. "Seriously, you're going to believe this rookie and some guy who just showed up claiming to be a captain?" George stepped forward, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "I am Captain George Harris, and I was on my way to meet with the commissioner when you illegally detained me and tried to frame me for drug possession." The crowd, momentarily silenced by the commissioner's arrival, began to murmur again, shouts of "justice" and "lock him up," spreading among the gathered onlookers. Commissioner Mitchell raised his hands, calling for silence. "This situation will be handled according to protocol. Officer Johnson is suspended pending a full investigation. Captain Harris, I need a complete report on my desk by tomorrow morning." Johnson's face twisted with rage. "So, this is how you treat me, Mitchell? After all these years? You know how things work on the streets. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to get results." A hush fell over the crowd. Even those who had been shouting for Johnson's arrest moments before were stunned by this admission. George stepped closer to Johnson, his voice low but audible in the sudden silence. "The rules aren't made to be bent, Johnson. They're made to protect everyone, including the officers who follow them. Your actions today, and apparently for years, have not only violated the law, but eroded the trust between the police and the community we swore to protect. Encouraged by George's words, David spoke up. "Sir," he addressed the commissioner, "I'm prepared to give a full statement about today's events and about other incidents I've witnessed during my time with Johnson." Johnson lunged at David, his face purple with rage. "You traitor! I'll destroy you!" Several officers rushed to restrain Johnson, who continued to shout threats and obscenities. Commissioner Mitchell, his face grim, nodded to the officers. "Take him away and make sure he's charged with attempted assault on an officer, in addition to everything else." As Johnson was led away, still yelling, George addressed the crowd. "I know many of you have lost faith in law enforcement. What happened here today is inexcusable, but I promise you this. Under my leadership, we will root out corruption, confront racial biases, and work tirelessly to rebuild trust with our community." The angry shouts from the crowd slowly turned into cautious applause. It wasn't full approval, but it was a start. As the scene began to disperse, George caught David's eye. The young officer stood a little taller, knowing he had made the right decision. The path ahead would be difficult, but today had proven that change was possible, one brave stand at a time. The confrontation was over, but the real work of reforming the department and healing the community was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as the fallout from Johnson's actions reverberated throughout the department and the community. The incident had exposed years of systemic issues within the police force. Johnson, stripped of his badge and gun, sat in a detention cell, far from the boastful officer he had been just days before. His arraignment was a media circus, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse demanding justice. Inside the courtroom, Johnson's facade of righteousness crumbled as the evidence against him mounted. David's testimony was damning, providing a first-hand account of the attempted frame-up. But it was what came next that truly sealed Johnson's fate. Encouraged by David's bravery, other officers came forward with their own stories. Years of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse by Johnson were exposed. Each new revelation sent shockwaves through the department and the community. "Your Honor," the prosecutor addressed the judge, "what we have here is not just an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior that has eroded the very foundation of trust between law enforcement and the citizens they have sworn to protect." Johnson's lawyer attempted to paint him as a product of his time, an old-school cop struggling to adapt to changing norms, but the evidence was overwhelming. As the judge prepared to announce the verdict, George sat in the gallery, his face a mask of calm determination. Beside him, David fidgeted nervously, the weight of his testimony heavy on his shoulders. "Officer Johnson," the judge began, his voice stern, "your actions have not only broken the law, but have betrayed the trust placed in you by this community. You have used your position of authority to intimidate and discriminate instead of protect and serve." The courtroom held its breath as the judge continued. "I find you guilty of all charges. You are sentenced to 5 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 3 years. Additionally, you are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity." A collective sigh swept through the courtroom, followed by a mixture of cheers and murmurs of astonishment. Johnson, his face pale, was led away in handcuffs. He no longer shouted or protested, but was silent and defeated. Outside the courthouse, George addressed the press and concerned citizens who were waiting. "Today, justice has been served," he began, his voice firm and resolute. "But this is only the beginning. We have a long way to go to rebuild trust and ensure that what happened with Officer Johnson never happens again." He turned to David, who was standing nearby, still processing the events. Officers like David Anderson, who had the courage to stand up for what is right, represent the future of our department. Moving forward, we will foster a culture of accountability and integrity. As the crowd dispersed, a mixture of hope and skepticism hung in the air. Johnson's downfall was a significant victory, but it had also exposed deeply entrenched problems that would not be solved overnight. George and David shared a meaningful look. Both knew the real work was just beginning. The department needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and they were committed to seeing the process through to the end. As they walked back to their patrol car, George placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You did well, Anderson. Your father would be proud." David nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. For the first time since joining the force, he felt he was truly living up to the ideals that had inspired him to become a police officer in the first place. Johnson's fall marked the end of an era, but it also heralded the beginning of a new one. The road ahead would be challenging, but with leaders like George and officers like David, there was hope for real, lasting change. In the weeks following Johnson's conviction, the police department underwent a dramatic transformation. Captain George Harris, now firmly established in his role, dedicated himself to implementing comprehensive reforms. The precinct was abuzz with activity as George called a general meeting. Officers filed into the briefing room with a mix of anticipation and apprehension on their faces. At the front of the room, George stood tall, with David by his side. "Officers," George began, his voice carrying both authority and warmth. "We are at a crossroads. The events of the past few weeks have shaken our department to its core. But out of this crisis comes an opportunity to rebuild, to do better, to truly serve and protect all members of our community." He outlined his plan: mandatory bias training for all officers, a civilian oversight committee, body cameras for every patrol, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in approval. "I know change isn't easy," George continued, "but it's necessary. We owe it to ourselves and to the community we serve." As the meeting concluded, David found himself surrounded by fellow officers, many congratulating him on his bravery, others seeking advice on how to navigate the department's changing landscape. Meanwhile, in the community, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. George made a point of attending neighborhood assemblies, community events, and even local basketball games, working tirelessly to rebuild the fractured relationship between the police and the public. One evening, as David finished his patrol, he spotted a familiar face, George's son Michael, playing basketball in a local park. David pulled over and stepped out of his patrol car. "Hey, Michael," David called. "Mind if I join?" The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding. As they played, other neighborhood kids joined in, and soon it was a full-court game. Kids and a police officer laughing and playing together. George arrived to pick up Michael and couldn't help but smile at the scene. He joined the game, and for a brief moment, the weight of his responsibilities lifted as he enjoyed the simple pleasure of a neighborhood basketball game. As the sun began to set, George gathered everyone around. "This," he said, gesturing to the diverse group of kids and adults, "is what community policing looks like. It's about being a part of the neighborhood, not just policing it." David nodded, fully understanding what George meant. This was why he had become a police officer, not to enforce laws blindly, but to be a positive presence in his community. In the months that followed, crime rates began to drop, and more importantly, community satisfaction with the police force increased. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges and setbacks, but the progress was undeniable. A year after the incident that had started it all, George addressed the graduating class of the police academy. David, now a decorated officer and mentor to new recruits, sat in the front row. "You are entering a noble profession at a critical time," George told the graduates. "Your job is not just to enforce laws, but to build trust, serve with compassion, and always stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult." As the new officers received their badges, there was a sense of hope in the air. The department had gone through a difficult period of self-reflection and change, but it had emerged stronger, more transparent, and more connected to the community it served. George looked at David and nodded. Both knew that the work was far from over, but they were on the right path. A new era of policing had begun, built on the foundations of integrity, accountability, and community collaboration. 2 years had passed since the fateful day of Johnson's arrest. The police department, under George's leadership, and with officers like David setting a new standard, had made significant strides in reforming its practices and rebuilding community trust. However, the specter of the past still loomed, especially as Johnson's appeal hearing approached. The courthouse was packed, with media camped outside and a mix of supporters and protesters filling the street. Inside, George and David sat stoically in the gallery, their presence a testament to the importance of this moment. Johnson, looking gaunt after 2 years in prison, was led into the courtroom, his once arrogant eyes now darting nervously around the room. His lawyer argued for a reduced sentence, citing Johnson's long service record and claiming he was a product of a flawed system. When it was the prosecution's turn, they did not hold back. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "Mr. Johnson's actions were not isolated incidents or simply the result of a flawed system. They were deliberate abuses of power that destroyed lives and eroded public trust in law enforcement. As evidence was presented, including testimony from people whose lives had been negatively impacted by Johnson's actions over the years, the true extent of the damage became clear. Families torn apart by wrongful arrests, careers derailed by planted evidence, and a community living in fear of those sworn to protect them. David was called to testify once more, his voice steady as he recounted not only the incident with George, but other instances of misconduct he had witnessed during his time as Johnson's partner. When George took the stand, he spoke not just as a victim of Johnson's actions, but as a leader of a department striving to correct the mistakes of the past. "Your Honor," George said, "the harm Mr. Johnson has caused goes beyond individual cases. He created a culture of distrust that we are still working to overcome. Our community deserves justice, not just for one incident, but for years of systemic abuse." As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this was about more than just the fate of one man. It was about accountability, about sending a message that no one is above the law, especially those entrusted to uphold it. Finally, the judge pronounced his decision. "Mr. Johnson, after reviewing all the evidence and testimony, I find no reason to reduce your sentence. Furthermore, in light of the additional evidence presented, I am adding 2 years to your original sentence. You will serve a total of 7 years, with no possibility of parole for 5 years." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Johnson slumped in his seat, the last vestiges of his defiance crumbling. Outside the courthouse, George addressed the waiting crowd. "Today, justice was served, not just for me, but for every member of our community who has suffered due to the abuse of power. But let this also be a reminder that our work is not done. We must remain vigilant, hold ourselves accountable, and continue striving for a system that truly serves and protects all people, regardless of race or background." As the crowd dispersed, David approached George. "Do you think this will make a difference, sir?" George nodded slowly. "It's a start, David. It sends a message that times have changed, that we're committed to doing better. But real, lasting change comes from what we do every day, in the streets, in our interactions with the community." They walked together towards their patrol car, ready to continue the work of building a better, more just system. The road ahead was still long, but with each step, with every act of integrity and courage, they were moving in the right direction. As they drove away, the setting sun cast long shadows over the city, a reminder that though darkness may persist, a new day always dawns, bringing with it the promise of justice, redemption, and hope for a better tomorrow.